When we think of Charles Darwin, we often picture a solitary, bearded figure sitting in a quiet study, perhaps staring out a window at a garden, slowly piecing together the puzzle of life. It is a very tidy image. But the first volume of his collected letters tells a much more frantic, messy, and collaborative story. These aren't just notes, they are the raw, breathing evidence of a mind in motion. When this volume was put together in 1902, the editors didn't just lay the letters out in a straight line from birth to death. Instead, they organized them into themes: evolution, botany, geology, and geographical distribution. They did this because Darwin didn't think in isolated silos. To him, a seashell on a beach, a finch on a distant island, and the way a mountain range was shaped were all part of the same grand interconnected story. To understand how that story began, we have to go back to 1831. This is where the narrative of the letters really takes flight, starting with his departure on the HMS Beagle. At this stage, Darwin isn't the world-changing icon we know. He's a young man, a student from Cambridge, stepping onto a ship for a voyage that would fundamentally rewire his understanding of the world. Through his letters and notes from this period, we see the transition from a curious student to a meticulous global naturalist. He isn't just looking at animals, he is collecting data. Thousands of tiny, seemingly insignificant details about geology and biology that would eventually serve as the bedrock for his greatest ideas. By the time he returns from the voyage in 1836, the quiet phase of his work begins, but it is anything but calm. This is perhaps the most fascinating part of the correspondence. We see him struggling with the weight of what he has observed. In his notebooks from 1837, we see the first real sparks of what he called the transmutation of species. It's a slow, agonizingly iterative process. He isn't sitting around with a sudden eureka moment. Instead, he is writing letters to friends, testing ideas, and retreating into long periods of silence to work through the implications of his findings. For over 20 years, Darwin carries this secret. He is terrified of the controversy his ideas will cause. He is a man of deep conviction, but also a man of immense caution. The letters show a man caught between the momentum of his evidence and the social and religious consequences of his conclusions. This tension finally breaks in 1858. It's a moment of genuine crisis. A young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace sends Darwin a sketch of a theory that is remarkably similar to Darwin's own. Suddenly, Darwin is forced to move. He can no longer sit on his findings. This leads to the joint presentation of their ideas, and shortly after, the monumental publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859. Once the theory is out in the world, the letters change character. The focus shifts from the broad strokes of how species change to the granular, gritty mechanics of how they do it. The 1860s find Darwin at the center of a scientific hurricane. He is no longer just an observer, he is a combatant in a fierce intellectual war. One of the most interesting threads in this volume is the way Darwin handles his scientific rivals. He wasn't just a gentleman scientist, he was a sharp, sometimes biting critic. He spent a great deal of energy attacking Richard Owen. Owen was a powerful figure who tried to maintain a very traditional, almost rigid, way of classifying animals. Specifically, Owen argued that there was a fundamental, structural difference in the brain that separated humans from apes. Darwin saw this as a desperate attempt to protect a traditional worldview, and he used his correspondence to dismantle Owen's arguments, insisting instead on a continuity between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom. On the other side of the battlefield, we see Darwin finding a powerful ally in Thomas Huxley. If Darwin was the architect of the theory, Huxley was its most aggressive defender. Darwin admired Huxley's intellectual sharpness and his willingness to fight the old guard of science. Through their letters, we see how Darwin relied on men like Huxley to provide the vigorous, public defense that his own more cautious nature sometimes prevented him from providing. As the letters move through the 1860s, we also see Darwin's work expanding into the realm of biogeography. This is where his friendship with Sir Joseph Hooker becomes vital. Hooker was a brilliant botanist and one of Darwin's closest confidants. Together, through a constant exchange of letters, they began to look at how life is distributed across the planet. They weren't just looking at what lived where, but why it lived there. They looked at how island isolation, specific climates, and even the presence of certain pollinators, like specific types of insects, could dictate the richness and variety of life in a given area. They were building a cohesive ecological picture of the world, one that connected the movement of continents to the flight of a butterfly. When we step back from the specific debates and the biological details, a few larger themes emerge from this volume. The first is the reality of how science actually happens. We often think of great ideas as lightning bolts that strike a lone genius in a moment of isolation. But Darwin's letters tell a different story. They show that science is a social, collaborative, and often heated process. He was part of a massive web of dialogue. He was constantly refining his ideas through debate, through the letters of his peers, and through the rigorous categorization of the natural world. He wasn't working in a vacuum, he was working in a community. There is also the theme of continuity versus discontinuity. This was the central tension of the era. The traditional view was that life was composed of distinct, fixed, and ordained categories. Darwin's letters are a lifelong struggle to prove that life is actually a continuous, gradual process of change. Every letter he wrote about a fossil, a bird's beak, or a plant structure was a small brick in the wall he was building against that old, static view of nature. But perhaps the most human element in these letters is the evidence of the physical toll his work took on him. We see mentions of his frequent bouts of illness, his exhaustion, and the sheer mental strain of carrying such a revolutionary idea. Darwin wasn't just a mind, he was a man with a body that often failed him, and he had to navigate his scientific life while managing significant personal health struggles. We also see the messy side of the scientific process. These letters aren't the polished final versions of his theories. They are the trial and error. They are the hurried notes, the half-formed thoughts, and the moments of doubt. They show us that the path to a paradigm shift is not a straight line. It's a winding, often frustrating road of revision and correction. By the end of this volume, the picture of Darwin has been completely transformed. He is no longer the static icon on a commemorative plaque. He is a living, breathing participant in a scientific revolution. We see him as a man deeply embedded in his time, fighting his battles, making his friends, and constantly adjusting his view of the world as new data arrived from every corner of the globe. The letters reveal that his genius wasn't just in his ability to see the pattern, but in his ability to listen to the world and the people studying it. He took the raw, chaotic data of nature and the intense, sometimes conflicting ideas of his contemporaries and wove them into a single, coherent explanation for the origin of life. It was a process of constant refinement, driven by an almost relentless curiosity and a commitment to the evidence, no matter how much it might upset the status quo.